I'm going to start and just introduce Nathan, our speaker today. Nathan is the founder of the Somatic School and is a somatic coach and has done lots of amazing work around this in this area of coaching. My name's Izzy. I work with Animas. If you need anything at all, please feel free to message me directly using the chat function. But we ask that throughout the call you keep yourselves on mute, just so that it's not distracting and there's no feedback or background noise. We're going to be here for 90 minutes today. Nathan is going to be showing his lecture for 60 minutes or around that, give or take a few minutes. And then we will have some time for questions. So yeah, just reiterating housekeeping rules. If you could try and keep yourselves on mute, message me if there's anything that you need directly. And again, just a note on the AI note takers, please do remove them if possible. With that, I'm going to hand over to Nathan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Apart from the fact that Nick is one of my most beloved friends, to this day, Nick's perspectives on coaching are probably amongst those that I have hold in the highest esteem and respect the most. And when I was invited to this to participate in this perspective series, I was delighted to be able to come and contribute to what feels like it's going to be a really rich body of work going out there, and will be forever available, I guess, on YouTube and available to the Animas alumni and beyond. So I'm very much looking forward to speaking on this particular topic as well, which was as requested in a sense by Nick. This topic of wholeness, because of course this is one of the 12 principles of the transformative coaching approach from Animas, and this is a particular topic which holds deep resonance for me. So before I pull up some slides, which is a funny story, actually. In fact, there'll be context for the slide story in just a moment, actually, once I've shown a bit more about me. But when I was a teenager, I was diagnosed with ADHD. I was about to do my GCSEs, or just about to. I'm not sure how old I was, but 15, I think. For those of you living in the UK, you'll probably be able to confirm. I believe I was probably around the age of 15 when that happened. And I remember vividly being up in my bedroom, trying to do homework or revision or revising for beginning to do my revision for GCSE exams or something like this. And I remember being in tears. I was always a very sensitive child, but I remember being in tears as I felt like I was just wrestling with myself. It was like somehow there was my intention and then there was my action, and they just weren't marrying up. And it was I remember feeling it was such a difficult experience. Getting the diagnosis at the time didn't really help so much, because unlike today, where we are living in the paradigm of neurodiversity, back then ADHD still was under the kind of description of, it very much looked at through the pathology lens of disease, disorder, dysfunction, and so with ADHD you kind of got a double whammy. You've got both deficit and disorder in the same word, so it's got in the same in the attention deficit disorder. So I really felt the blow of that as a young man or a teenage boy, and I remember for many years feeling broken. I'd been given this diagnosis which I didn't really understand, and I was being given medication to take to help. And I remember feeling a lot like I was broken and this medication was meant to fix me. Whether or not it did that, I think is for many it's very, very helpful. But for me, I actually, in my early 20s, I stopped taking meds. And liberation for me, I think, personally, began when I stopped trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. In my early 20s, I stopped taking meds and I started looking for more natural ways to manage the symptoms of what I understood to be ADHD. And I discovered mindfulness, which gave me an incredible connection to the present moment and to my subjective experience and to my senses. And this was the beginning of me kind of coming, what I might describe now, it was almost like coming home to myself or coming home to the body. It's no surprise to me that the book I read, The Mindfulness Prescription for Adult ADHD, was actually written by an interpersonal neurobiologist, which I'll talk a little bit about interpersonal neurobiology a little later. It was a real turning point for me. But the other turning point was actually me deciding to train as a coach. So I trained as a coach initially almost 11 years ago now at a leadership development consultancy, which I did performance coaching, a consultancy called Lane 4. But then shortly after that left and left that company to train at Animas Centre for Coaching. So some of you, and I trained as under Nick's tutelage, and the big turning point for me was, that moment of being able to be asked, what's right for this round peg? So I started changing the way I approached my life and started asking myself those questions, or putting myself in front of competent coaches who could ask me the questions of, what kind of a peg are you? What shape are you? Stop talking about pegs. What is your unique shape? And what is the kind of life that would fit that just right? And I think that's the beginning. That's just a little primer, I guess, for our topic today, because it's this journey from a sense of brokenness, perhaps, towards actually almost embracing a wholeness, I could say, that was sort of there all along. It's like a kind of a reclaiming of that of sorts, in a sense. Anyway, shall we get into it? Let's get started. I'm looking forward to sharing this topic with you. I told you there'd be a story about the slides. Well, in true ADHD form, I did these slides earlier today. In fact, I pretty much finished them just before the event to kind of in full transparency. And so you'll notice that the level of detail in the slides slowly diminishes as we make our way through the slide deck. But there should be plenty in here to keep us going. So putting the whole back in creative, resourceful, and whole. This is our event today, and this is our journey. Like I've mentioned, my name is Nathan. I'm the founder of the Somatic School. I haven't spoken much about the Somatic School, so perhaps what I'll share here is that in my coaching journey, I really had felt, perhaps because of my sensitivity, that being aware of nonverbal communication was very apparent to me as a valuable part of the coaching conversation. Why aren't we talking about it? Why at the time, around 10 years ago, were most trainings touching on this very lightly, if at all? And so not finding quite what I was looking for in terms of the skill set to work with the body somatically. We'll touch on that term a bit later, but essentially working with the integrated body-mind. I turned my attention to body psychotherapy, and I trained as a body psychotherapist in a number of modalities, namely Hakomi, focusing, did some Gestalt training, authentic movement, and more. The Somatic School was born out of the desire to create the coach training that I had been searching for, around the time that I was growing my coaching craft and practice. And so the Somatic School is where we train body-oriented coaches. So in other words, we train coaches to work with the body's intelligence, or the distributed intelligence of the body, both online and to be able to work with clients, whether online or in person, and work skillfully, safely, responsibly, ethically, and effectively. A little bit more about the Somatic School. I guess we were the UK's first ICF accredited somatic coach training provider, and the first intake was practically all Animas coaches. So I have a great affinity for a debt of gratitude to Nick for that initial support in getting the school off the ground, and then a great affinity for you Animites as well. And because of course I am an alumni from an old timer. Not that there'll be other people who'll be an older timer than me here, I'm sure. But we also at the Somatic School, we were the world's first somatic coach training provider to be awarded the ICF's new level 2 accreditation when they instigated their new accreditation categories. And we just recently were recipients of an honorable mention at for the distinguished coach education provider at the ICF's Impact Awards 2024, so just last year. So this question of wholeness is really our whole bag. It's the whole gig at the Somatic School, really. I mean, but this is one facet of the topic of somatics and working with the body in coaching. So what I've attempted to do today, and I hope you will be the judge of whether I've succeeded in this, is to expand this topic out from just simply focusing on the body and embodiment and somatics when in relation to this topic of wholeness. So I'm trying to give a broader view on this because I'm interested in looking at wholeness as a broader topic as it relates to coaching for the sake of this series. So let's jump in. What are some of these big questions then? So what does wholeness even mean? And when we say wholeness, what are we actually talking about? Is it something to be restored, discovered, or recognized, perhaps remembered? And so we'll be exploring that. Are we truly engaging with the whole of our clients or only parts of them? Some of these questions might be percolating for some of you as well. And I'd encourage you to share in the chat. Isabella will be there kind of receiving your reflections and questions. And I'm sure we can make time maybe out at the midpoint to sort of check in and see what's in the space around this. How might we unknowingly be working with a fragmented rather than integrated view of our clients? Let's explore this together. Now, are we, as coaches, truly embodying what we say we believe? So, to segue into this whole topic, let's flesh out this final point just a little further. No, in fact, I thought there was a different slide here. I'll come back to that final point in just a moment. Today, we're going to be focusing on as wholeness as starting point, destination. What is the alternative? Fragmentation, disconnection, something else? What does the whole is greater than the sum of its parts really mean in the context of coaching? How can a somatic perspective shift our understanding from mind-centered coaching to a body-mind approach? Or perhaps we could say working exclusively with thinking and verbal communication towards a more body-oriented approach. Why we must be mindful of not throwing the baby out of the bathwater as we expand our coaching horizons. So this will all make sense in due course, but this is what we're exploring today together. So that final point, as I said before, are we truly as coaches embodying what we say we believe? So what makes coaching distinct from some other helping professions? One of the distinctions or the distinctive characteristics of coaching is this. When we think about professional coaching, one of the phrases that bandies around the coaching industry at large is this one: our clients are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. Our clients are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. You will see it on the ICF's website. I believe the phrase originates from our friends over at CTI, Coaches Training Institute, Laura Whitworth, Henry Kimsey House, and Phil Sandal, who this expression is often attributed to. But to be honest, you see it all over the place in the world of coaching, especially where the ICF are concerned. And this line is an interesting one because it's where we begin as coaches in coaching conversations. It's our starting point. Our clients come into sessions with us, and what we say we believe is that our clients are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And the coaching approach reflects that belief in many ways. A question I'd like to hold lightly as we go through this is, do we behave like it though? We say it, but do we actually believe it? And if we do believe it, have we truly embodied that? Does it demonstrate itself within our coaching practice? So as we go through the event at this particular lecture today, let's hold that lightly and see where that takes us. So first up then, wholeness lost and found, the forgotten history of coaching. So there are many different strands that make up the history of coaching. If you are curious to learn more, of course, check out some of Nick Bolton's other lectures, many of which have explored this in depth. There's also a couple of books. If you can see this, I'm probably very small on the screen right now, but The Hidden History of Coaching by Lenny Wildflower. The Hidden History of Coaching by Lenny Wildflower, and Source Book of Coaching History by Dr. Vicky G. Brock, PhD. Very good, thorough introductions to the history of coaching. But what do I mean by the forgotten history of coaching? There's a few things that I'd like to just open up here, because I hold an opinion that I feel like coaching at some point, particularly around the time that coaching began to tilt towards like an emphasis on the grow model, I feel like coaching maybe lost its connection with some of its early roots. But, if we look at the historical roots of the coaching practice, you'll see we'll have examples from both from the Western world and from the East. So like in the Western philosophy, we've got the Socratic dialogue, we've got Aristotle's eudaimonia, and that whole kind of early Greek notion of human potential. In the Eastern traditions, we see influences on coaching such as from the wisdom traditions of the East, like Taoism, Zen Buddhism. So around the time in California, when coaching emerged out of the human potential movement, perhaps a little bit more on that later, but when coaching emerged out of the human potential movement, there was a meeting of worlds, East meets West, as for the first time, perhaps, some of the literature by Suzuki Roshi, for example, on Zen Buddhism, and Alan Watts, who was a huge advocate of these wisdom traditions like Taoism and Zen, were writing about this in English for the first time and sharing this with a Western audience. And so, or at least for the first time in pop culture, pop literature, and in the mainstream. And so, in the Eastern tradition, we've got things like, ideas like wholeness, natural harmony, simplicity, presence. But even more than that, we have lots of influence on the coaching approach that we can see in just the way that coaching sort of originated. It kind of derives some of its tenets from those teachings, which include, an emphasis on the present moment and perhaps how that shapes the future, an emphasis on subjective experience and remaining undetached from outcomes, enjoying the process, kind of like an awareness of process as it sort of unfolds within the dialogue of a coaching conversation. So that first wave of coaches really held from the generation that was exposed to these influences, kind of meeting of worlds, East meets West. So if we look at this here, we've got we also can look at, in these two different hemispheres, and it's far too simplistic to say that these are true, but we have different themes like individual versus society, mind versus body, reason versus emotion, that we have these differences in how the Eastern hemisphere and the West relate to these topics. Such, for example, in the West, we tend to be a bit more oriented towards more traditionally oriented towards the individual, and maybe personal autonomy, which you could describe as a kind of individual wholeness in a sense. attainment of personal autonomy and authenticity. Maybe you could say that's, is there a kind of wholeness that we've attained, so to speak, in that? In the West, we've got in the East, excuse me, we've got this more prioritization of relational wholeness. So self as interconnected with family, society, and so these are some themes. Also, there's a tends to be, or we often observe, an emphasis on the rational, reflexive mind in the Western world. In the East, we see more emphasis on body-oriented practice and a kind of unification of body and mind, which we're going to be exploring a bit later today. And also this topic of reason and emotion, and this, where emotion perhaps still plays a role in the way that we navigate social and societal circumstances were in the Eastern world, but perhaps less so in the West. Now, I should mention, and here's another book for you, there's somebody called Edward Slingerland. It's a fascinating surname. I wonder where Edward is from, but Edward Slingerland, he has written this book called Mind and Body in Early China, Beyond Orientalism and the Myth of Holism. It's very interesting from the perspective of wholeness, or holism, perhaps another word for that. He urges us to be, careful not to essentialize or exoticize, and to be mindful of the pitfalls of cultural caricatures and what he describes as, Orientalism here. So I want to share these distinctions, but I want to hold them lightly, because Slingerland, for example, and amongst others, challenge us about the oversimplification of, Eastern versus Western dualism, and suggesting that he suggests, and others do too, that both traditions have nuanced views on wholeness and or embodiment, for example. So just to name that, because I think that's important. Let's see. So yeah, we mentioned here about this kind of emphasis on the individual versus the collective, but this is something that we can think about as well as we relate to the parts and the whole. When we're doing coaching work, increasingly we see more holistic, I guess. It's just not quite with the typical use of that word there. I don't mean that quite as like that, but we see approaches to coaching emerging that are perhaps more systemic, for example, or somatic, and these often broaden out the inquiry to include more than purely the individual self sat in front of us, and so there's something here about the evolution of coaching over the passage of time, and we can see today, in today's world of coaching, we see more and more approaches emerging like this that include perhaps more of the whole in that more expanded sense of that. But what did I mean when I say, I think that coaching perhaps has lost touch with its roots? Well, if we look at this whole kind of notion of connection with subjective experience, with the present moment felt through the body, for example, with these other ways of knowing that are often referenced in the Taoist literature or Zen tradition, for example, I feel that in many ways many coaching approaches have sort of lost connection with those kinds of principles. And it's quite interesting because actually when we look at the humanistic roots of coaching, I'm fascinated by the fact that some of the forefathers, or some of the pioneers, I should say, of the coaching approach, or the pioneers of the humanistic tradition, and then who are hugely influential on the coaching approach, will often speak to these kind of principles in ways that you don't hear as much these days in coaching. For example, it's undeniable, I would say. I mean, some of you may argue with me on this, but I think it's largely undeniable that Carl Rogers is probably one of the most influential figures on the practice of on the kind of practice, art and science, the craft of coaching. What we call coaching today, I think, is hugely informed and influenced by Rogers' views, and that includes like a person-centered approach. That includes the whole notion of like the self-actualizing tendency and a belief in potential. And it's actually Carl Rogers who said something along the lines of, now I'm going to be paraphrasing here, but something along the lines of, um, uh, uh, I am convinced now that my sensory capabilities are more reliable than my I'm butchering this, but it's like my thinking mind or something like that. It's something like that. I'd love to find the actual quote here. I'm sorry I don't have it today, but look it up because I think it's fascinating to hear this. Almost like I read it as almost like this revelation of like, wow, Carl Rogers was very close to a colleague of his, Eugene Genlin, who created the focusing approach, and they did research together. And their research through their research, they created something called the experiencing scale, and they looked at what could predict successful client outcomes, and it had nothing to do with the actual approach of the practitioner and everything to do with what the clients themselves were doing. And what they noticed the clients were doing was something that they described as groping for words. So from the first session, if they heard clients doing this what they call groping for words, they would be able to predict if the clients themselves were connecting to this experiencing capacity of theirs, they would reliably have more successful therapeutic outcomes. So what they found them doing was saying things like, I left the house and after that argument, and I just felt so so angry. So angry. No, I didn't feel angry. It was disappointed. That's it. I felt disappointed. Something like that. Yeah. So do you see what I mean? Like that kind of and the question was, where are they going? Where are they going to know that when I hear myself say angry, when that's reflected back to me in a very person-centered way, how do I know that doesn't quite fit? How do I know that angry doesn't quite say what I mean? But disappointed, that's it. That's what I mean. That's, if I say disappointed, that feels like that fits my experience. And so the idea was that was connecting to a felt sense. Anyway, so I imagine that Carl Rogers probably was very inspired by some of this work, and for himself, apparently, also had this experience of connecting with a more of a sensory experience that gave him some kind of reliability, a reliable source of data, to use that classic coaching word there, data. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about the humanistic roots of coaching here. I would say, as it relates to wholeness, well, the humanistic tradition is very much about this notion we are essentially whole. First of all, the humanistic tradition was moving from pathology to potential. That was the big transition, the big shift, I think, from pathology to potential, emerging at a time of, where the vast majority of therapies were very much focused on pathology. Psychoanalytic approach or psychodynamic approach was the kind of, I suppose, one of the dominant therapeutic methods. And so this idea of moving the kind of locale to the orientation towards this potential was a big shift in the humanistic tradition. As such, there was this notion that equally, other than the idea that there is an equally significant force that's different from entropy, but that moves in perhaps the opposite direction. Where other approaches in science at the time was really focused on entropy, and also pathology. They were sort of saying, well, no, there's something in us that wants to live, that wants to grow, that wants to thrive and flourish. Much later, you can see that this has been carried forward by the positive psychology, the work of positive psychology, and other similar work. But in the humanists would, I think, probably the first to sort of begin to, or the humanistic psychologists, I should say, were probably the first to kind of begin to look at this and say, yeah, we're already whole. Nothing's broken. there's nothing to fix here. And if we start from that starting point, what does that do for our clients? One of the critiques of the humanistic approach, I should say, is that it has a sort of denial of pathology and things like this. And so, there's always a balance to be struck with these things. And I think, much like any modality and this lecture itself, take what you like and leave the rest and see what you think for yourself. In fact, I should have said this earlier when we had the slides with all the questions. This talk today is not here to provide answers as such, but rather to help give you some information so you can come to your own conclusions about this whole topic of wholeness. So, the other thing to mention as well is that in the late 1950s, Abraham Maslow, convened with meetings with Carl Rogers and other psychologists, and who were leading to lead an establishment of what was called the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. And in 1963, specifically, the American Association of Humanistic Psychology held the first national convention in Philadelphia, and 5 assumptions were established that as central to humanistic psychology. And the first of those 5 was, in fact, the whole person is more than the sum of their parts. And this was really the notion that rather than focusing on behavior or belief or this or that, rather than focusing on one particular problem point, for example, really what we want to be doing is looking at the human as a whole, the person, the client as a whole, the human organism as a whole, because really these different issues that clients are bringing are emerging out of a kind of constellation of these various things in a client's life. And so really, if we want to effectively support the client we're with, we need to work with the whole client. So again, let's just take a step back and look at coaching today. Are we doing that? That's my question, is like, are we doing that? We don't have to always be doing that, of course, but are we doing it? If the suggestion is that that's what works, at least that's what the humanistic psychologists believe, are we doing that more often than not? I'm not so sure. I'm not sure, but I wonder what you think. Maybe you can share in the chat. Let's explore that. Let's explore, like, where are we today? And because, of course, Nick often talks about Heidegger's notion of being thrown into a certain place and time, and beyond our control, we arrive here. The epistemology of our time, what we're living in and living through. And right now, there's a great deal of fragmentation. I really love Steve Hoskinson, founder of Organic Intelligence, describes as the age of disintegration. I think that's a really lovely language there to describe the kind of age we're living in right now. So I just gave you a little sneak peek of what's coming up next, but I'll say that we can see this in a variety of ways. Not least, also, like, there's increasing kind of tribalism, online and offline. We have like polarization, I should say. Polarization is just rife, and very much kind of us and them, and picking sides and that sort of thing. That's very much kind of the world we're living in right now. But I would say, for me, it goes a step beyond this particular moment in time. And actually, there was perhaps another period in time where a particular ideology almost, got kind of embedded in the Western world in particular, and it hasn't loosened up its hold, perhaps until now. Maybe now we're seeing this differently, beginning to. So René Descartes was a philosopher probably best known for the expression "I think, therefore I am." I think, therefore I am. So it's one of the most well-known kind of lines in philosophy. Basically, René Descartes kind of radicalized the distinction between the mind and body, and privileged the former over the latter. Descartes, like, we can be very critical of Descartes, but at the time, there wasn't we didn't have the means of understanding the human experience in quite the same way we do today. I mean, especially, we'll come again, like I said, later, to the topic of interpersonal neurobiology, for example, and all of these amazing ways that we have to study human experience scientifically that really are revealing just how integrated we are. But at the time, Descartes didn't have that. What he was doing was, he was a devout Catholic, and he equated the mind to the Christian notion of the soul, and which is ethereal and eternal, and that motivated him to invent this philosophical stance known as dualism, basically saying that reality consists of two kinds of distinct substances. You've got physical and mental, you've got matter and spirit, body and soul, brain and mind, and big part of this was actually so that this actually enabled the progression or the development of modern Western medicine, because it allowed people to do autopsies and experimentation on human bodies without it being sort of sacrilege, and so it was kind of, it served a purpose at the time, and perhaps, without kind of demonizing these various ideas, perhaps you could say that we can give thanks to Descartes for the progress we've made in modern Western medicine, and likely saving many lives today. However, I think there are elements of this that are problematic, and I'm not the only person who thinks this. Actually, there was the whole Cartesian split, this, what we've just discussed, just simply doesn't line up with modern science. And interestingly, the Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia intuited this long before we had the science to prove it. And so somehow I don't think it was a coincidence either that it was, not to be gendered here, but it's interesting to me that it was a woman who pointed out the cracks in his thesis and said, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense to me. And she kind of pointed out a failure of his to being, like, faithful to his own approach, even in light of kind of critique, and so basically the Cartesian split has left a mark, and what that is the idea that it's reduced the human body to an assemblage of parts, basically. It's mind over matter. And today, and this is purely an opinion, some of you may love people like, I don't know, oh God, what's his name? Name. Probably a good thing I can't remember now. I wouldn't want to cast aspersions, but there are many people, especially in the kind of like in the more like new age spaces and all, but also lots of personal development spaces, that kind of mind over matter message is very strong, even today. And if the name comes back to me, Dr. I can't remember. Anyway, but anyway, the living sense of the body and its propensity for sense making has kind of been blotted out by these kind of top heavy concerns with the brain, mind, consciousness, language, and this traditional Cartesian view of the body and the kind of all powerful rational mind has very deep roots. We see the depth of this spanning everyday attitudes, interests, values, behaviors in the modern Western world in particular. We just see its fingerprint all over Western society. And so, and in every area, science, sports, fashion, and professional coaching, I would argue. And so, this is when we talk about wholeness and we talk about fragmentation, I think Descartes' philosophy is as strong today as it ever has been in the at large, but there are many thinkers such as Maxine Sheets Johnstones, who's a philosopher who think differently. So she says Cartesianism itself is a cultural disease. Cartesianism, wow, try saying that fast 3 times. Cartesianism tells us that we are schizoid creatures, one half of which is little more than a mechanical rig for getting us about in the world, like a taxi for the brain. Our only way out is through corporal reflection, she says, which is what Carl Rogers was pointing to, through a recognition and a contemplation of the deep structures of our bodily selves. We have the possibility of rediscovering and reaffirming wholeness. So here's a perspective on how we might actually sense the wholeness that we are, if we want to put it that, or because she says, rediscovering or reaffirming wholeness, that inherent wholeness that we heard spoken about in the humanistic traditions, and that the body is key to that, I think is an important point. And of course, I'm biased here, but I'm not the only person who thinks that way. So let's put it that way. Cool. All right. Okay. There's one more idea I want to share with you, and then we will and then I will maybe check in, and perhaps Isabella, we can kind of see are there any reflections or thoughts, and just to talk about, and then we'll kind of do the second half of this. But first of all, I want to give you an idea of what we might be missing. What we might be missing if we are exclusively working with the thinking mind and our kind of conceptualizations, mental meaning making, and that kind of, like I said earlier, that reflective mind. So Alan Fogel is a Rolfer, but he's also a scientist who has written a few books now, one of which is called Body Sense. But he coined this term, embodied self-awareness, and made this very interesting kind of distinction here, which you could say is a bit of a dualism, but between conceptual self-awareness and embodied self-awareness. In reality, the two mingle constantly with each other. But it's interesting for us as coaches, because I think you'll see quite quickly, perhaps, how much time we tend to spend in the left-hand column. So conceptual self-awareness is thinking about the self. Embodied self-awareness, on the other hand, is feeling or experiencing the self. So the self thinking about the self, or self-experiencing itself, is another way of putting it. Conceptual self-awareness based on linguistic and symbolic forms of expression. The typical coaching conversation tends to be exclusively that. Embodied self-awareness based on sensing, feeling, and acting. All right? Conceptual self-awareness engaged in a thought process. Again, can we see that how much time are we spending in the left column versus the right? Being in the subjective emotional present is the embodied self-awareness equivalent. Conceptual self-awareness tends to be abstract. It transcends the present moment. In other words, it's what we talk about when we talk about, our vision for our future, for example, what we want, where we're trying to get to. Our clients, talking about their vision, their hopes, their desired outcome for what they want some point in the future. Maybe it talks about the present moment, but it's talking about it in terms of ideas and beliefs that we might have. So these abstractions, where embodied self-awareness would be concrete, lived in the present moment, this concrete experience. So both, you can probably see here, both are incredibly relevant. In fact, this is probably a good time to talk about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Well, it's at least at one place that we can talk about that, because what we're not saying here is that we want to shift our attention as coaches from conceptual self-awareness over to embodied self-awareness. Although Alan Fogel describes lots of the many benefits of reconnecting to embodied self-awareness for our for our physical well-being and our mental health, etc. Like the embodied self-awareness has a host of benefits that in the modern world many of us are not we are suffering perhaps because of our disconnection from being disconnected from embodied self-awareness, so being disembodied, you could say. But there's value to both. You can see clearly that thinking about oneself, linguistically expressing oneself, being engaged in our thought processes, talking about things that transcend the present moment, like the future, for example, is essential for coaching. And so I think what we're talking about more here is, or what I might be offering here perhaps, is that to work with the whole of our client, to work with the whole of ourselves as coach, we might want to look at including both sides and perhaps integrating both sides within a session, both conceptual self-awareness and embodied self-awareness. And I'll speak a bit more to not throwing the baby out with the bathwater when I get to this in somatics, but perhaps for now, I'll pull the screen share down for a moment. Let's just check in, Isabella. We're at this point here, probably around halfway through. Are there any reflections or thoughts that are worth sharing into the space and kind of like, that we can check in at this moment?
Just inviting people to just chat into, maybe write a message into the chat. I'm just going to have a scroll through to see if there were any reflections. Oh, someone did ask, Nathan, if it was possible for you to potentially send over the names of the books that you mentioned. Just a few people curious about that. I'll just read this one reflection here from Cormac. I'm curious about people dropping out of coaching that I often have sensed needed and wanted it the most. I wondered if this was because of the expectation of an instant fix, as with so much of today's digital age, versus having to do the personal work to make progress in finding their whole selves.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that instant fix. And I guess that kind of brings up, I know that, wasn't it? I think that's Nick's most recent lecture, Human All Too Human. And it kind of brought up some of that topic around AI as well. But just as Nick mentioned in that talk, where AI doesn't feel ambivalent or and there isn't ambiguity can't hold the nuance of the human experience. What's one thing what's another thing AI can't do? It can't sense. It cannot feel. It can't experience. There is something that Daniel Siegel refers to as our resonance circuits, and this includes mirror neurons, certain brain regions, that all are the kind of neurobiological basis of empathy. We can empathize with people through dialogue alone, but so much of our empathetic capacity comes through these biological mechanisms that are inbuilt, we are designed for that. We are mammals, in fact, I was going to say earlier that it's not only Eastern philosophy that thinks about the notion of how humans are very much part of the collective and not just the individual, because it was Aristotle, I believe, that talks about like the human as the social animal, the political animal, the social animal. And I think that you could take that step. Not only are we social animals, we are mammals. We are truly, we are social creatures. It's a biological imperative. I recently did a talk about co-regulation mastery for coaches, it was called, and it was like, the idea that co-regulation is being described today as a biological imperative for us. We can't survive without others. So this idea of this kind of quick fix and instant fixes in a digital age, versus having that, that perhaps slower process, it is interesting, isn't it? What are we losing? What are we losing out on there in terms of our wholeness?
There's a couple more reflections. Sabrina says, also the discomfort of deep personal work can be overwhelming, especially if you're disconnected from your body.
the discomfort, deep personal work can be overwhelming, especially if you're just going to absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I suppose this comes back to the idea that when there are how to put it, additional and important considerations as we've been to expand our coaching horizons and bring in more of the client or ourselves that are important for working safely, for working in a way that creates an environment of trust and safety, that enables people to begin to do that, as Sabrina, as you described it, that kind of deeper personal work without, to work at, for example, somatic depth without feeling out of your depth. And at the Somatic School, this is one of the things that we have put a great emphasis on, because as we start to open up, if you've been separated from or disconnected from these other facets of our being for a very long time, that process of reconnection can be jarring for some, at best, for some people. So for some people it could be or not just jarring but completely overwhelming, as Sabrina mentioned. So there's a lot of considerations there. And I love what Margarita said there as well, just on that point of Aristotle being, also offering this perspective that we are social animals. The man who is alone is either a beast or a god. It's interesting. Yeah, I'd love to unpack that one. Cool. Great. Oh, cool. I wonder, Isabel, if I'm going to be able to get a copy of the chat here, because I can see some people have shared some different references and things, and I'd love to pick those up myself later as well.
I'll make a note to save the chat and send it over to you.
Awesome. Yeah. Hey, we're in. This is an interactive lecture, although it's more of a lecture style than I'm used to. But I like this idea of it being a kind of reciprocal exchange as well. If you have other ideas and references and things you want to share, please do. We're all lifelong learners. I think coaches, more than perhaps anyone else I know, coaches tend to be these lifelong learners. And so we're kind of in that together. I love that. Okay, cool. So let's move on then. So next up then, we're looking at wholeness from the perspective now of somatics. I've already been alluding to this throughout, and of course, I guess this is I live and breathe this stuff, so it's hard for me to not kind of go there. But what does somatics offer us? Well, it offers us a kind of this movement from dualisms to unity. So one of the things one of the ideas that I'm a huge fan of, and that we talk about a lot at the Somatic School and in relation to body image coaching, is the idea of the unification of body and mind. It's quite striking to me that even in the world of somatics, I'll finish that sentence and I'll explain what somatics is. But even in the world of somatics, we hear people talk very often about body and mind influencing body, body influencing mind. But I'm really interested in this idea of this unification. I once, it's going to sound a little out there. it's going to sound out there when we get and tell you where we're going next. It's going to get even more out there in the next few slides, but after the somatics piece. But I was once in meditation and I posed the question, what am I here to do? just to see what would happen, what might come back. And the words undoing the Cartesian split coming back, undoing the Cartesian split. For me in my life, I feel like I'm very passionate about this idea that this arbitrary distinction between body and mind is problematic. I think I much prefer the language of body mind when we talk, and quite often now I won't necessarily say body or mind, but rather just this fusion, one word, body mind. Now, for those of you who are that way inclined, you could absolutely add spirit onto the end there. I mean, there's probably other words you can add on there as well, but if it still remains one word, that would still maintain the sentiment of this, which is basically the idea that that we don't have mind without body, and that I guess bodies don't exist without mind. So so this idea of this one word is a kind of moving away from the, like, really moving away from the dualism between body and mind, not just saying body hyphen mind, body mind connection, for example, but we're really moving away from a dualistic perspective on body and mind when we fuse these words together. And I forget there's a female author who I say she's female because I remember it was a female name, but I can't remember what her name was, but she wrote a book by that title, Body Mind, and kind of coined that term, and it's been used, but now it gets used quite widely, especially in the world of somatics. Okay, so I said I would share a little bit more about what somatics is. For those who don't know, essentially it's this. Essentially, somatics is the notion that the body is an expression of mind and vice versa. I love this quote by Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who says, if you want to know how the wind is blowing, look at the sand. If you want to know how the wind is blowing, look at the sound. You want to get a sense of someone's state of mind, you can look at what's happening in the body. Facial expressions, perhaps tone of voice, gestures, body language, posture, etc. Even characteristic holding patterns in the body will absolutely reflect the state, the kind of state of someone's mind. But, like I said, even in the world of somatics, you still have that dualism between body and mind sometimes. And I'm really a big fan of this notion of body-mind. It's actually very well supported by our latest understanding from the cognitive sciences. So the current cognitive science, our most current cognitive science, in fact, is quite emergent at the moment. It's something that is now being referred to as 4E cognition. And 4E cognition takes cognitive science into a realm that I just find absolutely riveting, because for me it sort of almost starts to move us towards this idea that the most hardcore sciences are beginning to tell the same story as, like, the wisdom traditions or the theologians, world faiths, so basically 4E cognition stands for the idea that cognition and the emergence of mind as well is embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. Embodied, naturally, we don't have mind without body. Embedded, it's a bit like that notion of thrownness, but it's the idea that we are where we are in place, and our surroundings, our environment shapes how we think, and our cognitive capacities. Enacted has to do with how we actually, even our sense of self, we almost are creating ourselves anew in every moment, in a way, just by the way that we kind of show up in the world. And then this idea of extended is a very interesting topic. The idea of the extended mind is the idea that not only does the mind extend beyond our kind of, what I think are quite rudimentary ideas of mind being encaged, or kind of like in kind of housed within the brain. Not only is it not only in the brain, but or even distributed throughout the body, but actually extends beyond the bounds of our skin, and that's a very fascinating topic. And so anyway, 4E cognition, check it out. And yeah, let's see here. So we've got, I mean, somatics itself is a kind of, we say at the Somatic School, we're in the business of bridging. And so, somatics itself kind of bridges these various dichotomies, East and West, science and spirituality, mind and matter, masculine and feminine, rational and intuitive. So with this topic of wholeness, how might it be to include all of this, all in the mix, that for example, that to be a great advocate of evidence-based scientific research doesn't negate your ability to also be a deeply spiritual person, for example. And I think a lot of people live very fragmented lives at the moment. In fact, I know a lot of my colleagues at the Somatic School and a lot of our somanauts, our alumni, have often shared that their that a big motivator for beginning to work in a more whole person, whole being way is motivated by the fact that perhaps they show up in one way to work and feel that they have to cut off a part of themselves before they enter their space, that they can't expose, or they can't express certain aspects of their being, for fear of, chastisation, like being like rejected, or it not being acceptable or appropriate. And I think in part that reflects kind of where we are as a society, as a culture as well. If you can't bring a more intuitive approach, for example, to to a corporate senior leadership level meeting, boardroom meeting sort of thing, for example. Anyway, I think that's one of the things that the whole area of somatics affords us, and how it lends itself well to this topic of wholeness here. Here's a little interesting exploration for us here as it relates to somatics, and it relates to the topic of wholeness, at least in my opinion. You can decide for yourself whether it's interesting to you too. So, reality. Reality as story, state, or both. Let's have a look. Or something else. We hear this a lot, right? Just by show of hands, who's heard the idea that our thoughts create our reality? By show of hands, I can actually only see 4 of you on my screen, but I'm sure that actually all 4, the 4 that I can see, who are my appointed panel for today's question there, all raised your hands. So yeah, our thoughts create our reality. Like again, Joe Dispenza. That was the person I was trying to think of earlier. Joe Dispenza. I knew his name would come to me. Joe Dispenza is a great example of somebody who, is very popular, very prolific kind of writer and speaker, and who's really got a big following, and is very much about, as an example of our thoughts create our reality, very much an example of mind over matter. In fact, I don't want to cast aspersions, so do not. And it's not a judgment, but I just fact. I once heard him on an interview say, sometimes he'd wake up in the morning and his body doesn't want to get out of bed. So he says, "Hey, I'm the boss of you. Get out of bed." Oh, it pains me. It pains me, but I'm a somatic guy. So I would be pained by that. But like for me, and the whole body into approach is actually to have a really respectful relationship with our bodies, and actually to listen. What do you want me to know? You don't want to get out of bed today? Well, what is that? Now, sometimes that can be like, just to offer this into the mix, just throw it into the mix. Sometimes that can be avoidance of something, sometimes it can be burnout. Now, if it's avoidance of something, but you check in with the body and say, "Hey, what's up?" Not I'm the boss of you, but what's up? What's going on? You might go, "Nah, I know what this is about. I've got that knot in my stomach. I do not want to get up and do this thing. I really don't want to, it's going to be hard work and I just don't want to do it." And the alternative is, for example, just by way of example, burnout. And if you ask the body what's up, it goes, "Don't get out of bed. I can't go on." When Gabor Mate wrote a book called When the Body Says No, for example. And when the body says no, in my opinion, we must listen. We must. And actually, I don't think it is my opinion, of course, but there are dire health consequences to not listening. And many of you can probably attest to that yourselves. So our thoughts create our reality is this idea that we see a lot in the main, and it's valid. Hey, like, we know from our coaching work that thoughts are powerful. Thinking is powerful. The way we think about something does shape our experience of our world. Our perception is distorted and changed because of our thinking and our beliefs, for example. But then, on the other hand, it's interesting that in the world of somatics, who here by show of hands heard of polyvagal theory? Polyvagal, cool. Yeah. So I got 3 of the 4 on my panel raised their hands. Great. So polyvagal theory is one of the leading sort of and the most widely embraced theory, it is nonetheless a theory on how the autonomic nervous system functions. And I think one of the reasons it's gained such popularity is because intuitively we can see how it lines up with our lived experience, and people can it's very accessible in that way. People can go, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. I can relate to that. It's also very empowering in a variety of ways. And one of the ways that it empowers people is that we can start to lean into this notion that story follows state. What that means is that our narrative, our thinking, is a product of our autonomic state in that moment. For example, we all know the experience of waking up in the morning early after getting a late night's sleep the night before. Maybe you've drank some alcohol, or maybe you, I don't know, ate late, or maybe you were binging a Netflix series. Unfortunately, I can't give like a contemporary example of what that might be because I don't have TV anymore, but which sounds weird when I say that out loud. I don't know if I've ever shared that publicly before, but yeah, imagine you're binging. And the last time I binged a Netflix series, it was The Umbrella Academy. I don't know if anyone's watched that. I just found it very entertaining. Anyway, let's say you've been doing that the night before. You wake up way too early after getting nearly enough sleep. You have to rush to work because even though you woke up early, you're late. You couldn't eat breakfast. You couldn't get your morning coffee. You get to the car park. Somebody's in your parking spot. If that happens. And when you get up to your desk, a colleague of yours, let's say it's a direct report, you're their manager, and they come and they say that they tell you that they haven't completed on the report that they said they were going to give you. This is a super corporate example. And you are like, you think to yourself, this idiot, and your response is aggressive and reactive, and you let them know how disappointed you are, and you send them away with their tail between their legs, and you're stressed out for the rest of the day, and everyone that comes your way for the rest of the day is an idiot, and the whole day is really hard work, and at the end of the day you think that was a terrible day, and that person's an idiot and this person's an idiot. Sorry. Enough of the idiot. Okay, so alternative reality, alternative scenario. You have a nice home cooked dinner and get to bed at a really reasonable time after reading your favorite book. Heck, maybe you do some meditation before bed. You've wound down really nicely. You have a really good night's sleep. And fortunately, you've got a really abundant morning. Like time-wise, you can wake up at a decent time after getting a nice sleep. You get to do your morning routine, have your favorite breakfast. And indeed, you had your morning coffee, if you drink coffee. And then you head over to the office. You get there. Somebody's in your car parking space. But you're like, oh, don't worry. I know there's another spot around the side. You go and park there. You go up to the office, and Charlie, let's call this particular colleague Charlie comes, tells you haven't done the report, and you say, okay, what happened? And they say this, and they okay, all right, couldn't have been avoided. It's going to be okay. We'll figure it out. And Charlie is innocent in your mind. Your narrative is Charlie's fine. He couldn't have avoided the situation. It's fine. I like the guy. He's still in training. Let me see how I can support him. The rest of the day, you feel really good for helping him out. You feel good about everyone. So there's just an example of how your biology, your autonomic state changes everything. Those are quite long examples, but hopefully you got you got the idea. Story follows state. If you are sympathetically activated, stressed out, that's fight or flight. You're probably likely going to be in that similar space as the former story. In the latter, that's probably more likely to be that ventral vagal space, as they say in polyvagal theory, where all is okay. I'm in my social engagement system. So story follows state. So what is it then? Is reality story? Is it state? Is it both? Yeah, and I like to say, and this is a funny little tongue twister that I recently thought of, it's always all of it all at once. I personally think, again, this moves us away from this duality. I think it goes both ways. I think it's always happening in this way all the time. That we humans, in fact, life itself, in my opinion, is networked, is systemic, is like a web of activity, and is utterly interconnected in that way. And so your thoughts shape your experience, your reality. Your autonomic state shapes your thinking, and it could go either way or both ways. And and ultimately at the end of the day, the thinking emerges out of biology anyway. Where else would it come from? Because even our neurological processing is a function of the brain organ within our bodies. Anyway, so I could wax lyrical on this, but we're really talking about here a both-and perspective. It's both thought thinking and its state, autonomic state. It's both. It's both. It's both. You could say it's both spirit and matter. If you wanted to go there too, at the same time. So there's a perspective. There's a perspective in wholeness, and perhaps a bit of an opinion piece there as well. Which leads me on to the final slide here. And I'm going to keep this one brief because this is perhaps the most out there one, which is the idea of the one and the many, an integrative wholeness. So I've been moving us slowly in this direction, but here we're kind of talking about the notion of like moving from duality and to the other end of this, which is the total non-duality. This is the idea that wholeness is absolutely inherent and that our reality is utterly interconnected. Now, in theology, let's see if this is in theology. You have two ideas that relate to this. One could be pantheism, which is the notion that everything is God. Okay, that's one perspective on that. Another is panentheism, which is the idea that the divine, for example, kind of transcends, but also transcends our known reality, but is also immanent within it. And so I know this is a very expanded view of wholeness here when we're starting to talk about theology and non-duality, but we can also kind of bring it back. You can also kind of ground it a bit as well. For example, Alfred North Whitehead is one of my favorite philosophers. He created something that he called the philosophy of the organism. Surprise, surprise! It's one of my favorite philosophies, but it's these days known more commonly as process thought or process philosophy. And Alfred North Whitehead is known for saying the many become one, and then increase by one. And what this means basically is that genuine wholeness isn't uniformity, it's integration. So it's the idea that basically what happens is, and this is what I think we mean when we say the whole is more than the sum of its parts. What Alfred North Whitehead was trying to say here is that when you have a collection of parts, they integrate to form a whole. And that whole, let's call that one, the many parts become one, and is now part of a larger whole. So it's like this idea of like nested or fractals or nested parts of the system. We have the parts of our human experience that form our sense of self, right? Which is the many becoming one, and this self is part of a community, for example, and that community itself as a whole, which is part of a larger community of different species on the planet, and then that is part of a larger whole, which is all living things, including the perhaps plant life, etc. And that's part. And again, we go on further and further, and we just all the way to the cosmos and beyond. So this idea, I think, you don't have to have spiritual, theological belief to kind of grasp this idea of the many become one. I mentioned already the idea of panentheism and mysticism. So the mystics kind of view all is interconnected, everything is a whole, and it includes complexity. But this notion of panentheism as well allows for multiplicity without erasing individuality as well. So, like I said here, wholeness includes complexity and multiplicity without erasing individuality. So, there is one of my favorite the last thing I'll say about wholeness as it relates to this very extended view of wholeness, which is like the kind of about as whole as you can get, which is the totality of all things, which is the non-dual perspective, is this, which is a poem that I love by Kabir, who was an Indian mystic and saint, and it's called Hiding in This Cage. And the poem goes, hiding in this cage of visible matter is the invisible life bird. Pay attention to her. She is singing your song. And what I love about that, as it relates to coaching, perhaps, is that I think as coaches, what we're supporting our clients to do is actually connect with the invisible life bird that is within us, within each of us, that is singing their song and their song uniquely. And remember, kind of circling right back to the beginning, what shape are you? And what does a life that fits that shape just right look like? I kind of feel that that's part of our role as coaches, is to say, what song is your invisible lifebird singing? I mean, not exactly in those words necessarily, but what song is your invisible lifebird singing? And what unique contribution does that make to the great symphony of life? Because in my opinion, and this is a very non-dual perspective, is that life is a grand symphony. And every single individual, every single being on this planet sings their own song. And that song is absolutely essential for the symphony. And the what that means then is that unity is about harmony, not uniformity. It's about harmony. And so we have the one and the many, each song making up each individual song, or each individual, tune, let's say, making up a different part of a great symphony, which is life itself. Which is the each little melody makes up the part of a larger melody. And that we call life. And I just think that we talk a lot in coaching about fulfillment. We talk about clients living meaningful lives and authenticity, self-actualization. And I feel that, for me, in embody into coaching, I think that's what, at least for me, I like to think about it as that we're helping people kind of make their contribution to the larger whole, to the health of the whole, you could say, to the health of the whole, So, okay. So, actually, I'll just share these last few slides and then Isabel will come to you. So that wraps me up now, and actually really good timing. I think we've got 10 minutes left. Isabel, is that right?
Yeah. So I was just going to say we've probably not got time for a half an hour Q&A because we've only got 10 minutes left. But yes, 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. Great. Okay, fine. So my bad. Didn't realize we were doing a half an hour Q&A. So so I'm so sorry. So okay, hopefully we'll be able to ask you a couple of questions. So if you've sat here and you've been thinking, hi, if you'd not been thinking, if you'd like to say, hi, I'm, and I'm a body into coach, if that's something you're interested in, we've been talking a lot about working with the whole person, whole client. That's what we do at the Somatic School. So if you'd like to learn more about how to train as a body into coach, you can find us on www.somaticschool.com. We're also on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Substack, or you can scan this QR code here and come along to one of our free introduction to body into coaching events, should you want to. Yeah, okay, cool. I think then in that case, let's do what we can with the time that we've got left, Isabel. Yeah, great.
So yeah, if people want to raise their hands, or I'm just wondering if maybe it would be easier to put the questions in the chat so that we can kind of condense it as much as possible. What would you prefer, Nathan?
Do you know what? I would love to invite a bit of interaction, but if we can ask everyone to be in the spirit of brevity so that we can get as many questions in as possible, and I'll try to do the same in response.
Yeah. Perfect. That's a great way to frame it. So yeah, so people want to raise their hands, and then we'll get underway with questions.
I'm also having a little scroll through the chat here, Isabella, just in case there's anything that we've on there. Bella says, I'm curious whether working online with clients makes it more challenging to support that co-regulation and limbic resonance or not. Great question, Bella. Absolutely brilliant. First of all, I recommend checking out that talk I did recently about co-regulation. It's on YouTube, Co-Regulation Mastery for Coaches School. But does it affect it working online? So in that talk, I talk about the fact that there is something Stephen Porges coined called neuroception. Neuroception is the way that our nervous system scans the environment moment to moment for survival reasons, for cues of welcome and cues of warning. In other words, it scans our environment for threat. Am I safe? Is fundamentally what our nervous system, is the question our nervous system is asking. Now, those cues of welcome and warning, for example, are largely picked up in mostly facial expressions, tone of voice, rigidity, prosody in the voice, like a melody in the voice, softness in the eyes, relaxation in the body, or that's the cues of welcome. And that supports co-regulation. Cues of warning are things like a monotone voice, a flat affect, or like a furrowed brow, a stare or a glare in the eye, or a lack of eye contact completely, rigidity in the body. And that would be registered by the nervous system as a cues of warning. And this is often below our conscious awareness. Now, the cues of welcome support co-regulation. Cues of warning, of course, create dysregulation in a nervous system, and most of that can be picked up online. Like it's very, unless you have very grainy, very poor image, and even then, if running your audio is good, you'll still be able to pick much of that up online. So, great question, Bella. And yeah, what we find is that I would argue that there's very little that can't be accomplished online, other than not versus offline for somatic work, other than hands-on body work, which for obvious reasons. So okay, cool. Yeah, Gwen, I see Gwen. Yeah, Gwen's got a question. That's a lovely question. How does it influence my coaching? In a number of ways. I used to have the experience with clients quite often that we were circling around something, but never quite getting to the heart of the matter. Or on other occasions, we might both slip into what I used to describe as kind of like a problem-solving mode. I would find if the client was struggling a lot, I might feel like a little pull to kind of work a bit harder somehow. Then I'm working hard, they're working hard and frustrated. I'm feeling a bit frustrated, and we get a bit stuck. With body oriented coaching, with working with the body and with coaching with body and mind, I think what we find is that it's a gentle and subtle, and sometimes invites a slower pace. It's a gentle and subtle approach, and sometimes invites a slower pace, but it gets directly to the heart of the matter. And sometimes, as someone said earlier, that can be a little bit like surprising or shocking for some people. Like emotion, they may come in contact with some emotion that's been there. So again, there are a number of considerations that are highly important, knowing what to do, and importantly, what not to do, to ensure that you're working safely and responsibly and ethically, and therefore effectively. But when you do those things, you can get straight to the heart of the matter. And I find that means that the waters we swim in as body-oriented coaches is the aha moment. So instead of the aha moment being a holy grail in a coaching session that only happens occasionally now and then, oh, what a great session, great big aha moment. It's almost like very frequently, throughout the session, aha moment, aha moment, aha moment, because we're just accessing that which is not already known. And so the insights are felt very deeply, and their experience is very profound, because they sort of seemingly come from nowhere quite quick, quite immediately. And when they do, they're kind of accessing clients' deepest truths. That's just one example of how the coaching is impacted by working with the body. But there are many, many others. Does that help, Gwen, as a starter for 10?
Yeah, just one last question from Tamsin, and then I'm really sorry, everybody. We'll have to wrap up there for today.
In all honesty, I don't have a lot of thoughts on EFT. Truth be told, I've tried it. I've been a client in an EFT session once before. Personally, for me, I thought it was a pleasant experience, but I didn't. It didn't feel like something I wanted to repeat. But that's just personally for me, and that's not a judgment on the modality itself. So I have limited experience with it. I think that EFT is also a nice gateway almost, or like an entry point into doing more somatic style coaching work, if you integrate EFT into your coaching. Because it's very, very gentle and it's very light, though it can go quite deep. I understand from people I've heard from. Yeah, the interesting thing is, I think a lot of the time when people hear somatic coaching or somatic work, they think that it looks one way. In reality, the diversity within the field of somatics is astounding. There are so many ways to work somatically. So at the Somatic School, for example, we draw on a number of established and respected modalities that are all process oriented. They kind of share that in common. But that's one particular orientation or one particular way of doing somatic work. Besides that, there are discharge model approaches. There's the adjustment model style of working somatically. And those are described like a collection, a way of working. Process is kind of like about stewarding intelligent unfolding. Discharge is about kind of releasing excess energy or emotional release. And quite often, like more old school approaches to trauma were like that. Adjustment model is like pretty classical body work, straightening a crooked limb kind of thing, helping people with alignment, feeling better in themselves through like hands-on body manipulation. But those are just to name a few, and there are many, many more. And EFT, I guess, is one of them. Would I even describe it as somatic? I think, yeah, I suppose I would. But I'm not clear on exactly how it functions. Like, I don't know what is happening when we do the tapping that makes it effective. And I guess it's not going to be effective for everyone, but there's no one size fits all. So
thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to draw the session to an end now, but it's been really great to listen, Nathan, and we've got lots of lovely feedback on the chat. I'm sure you can see lots of positive reactions. We did record today's session, so it will be on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to watch again. And Nathan, if you're able to maybe email myself and the team that list of books as well, and we can get that sent out to everybody, because I know there was a few questions about that.
absolutely.
But yeah, thank you so much, Nathan.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great fun. Yeah, I will hopefully be back again sometime in the future. And see you soon. If not at a lecture, at maybe like an Animas reunion of some sort.
Yeah, let's do it. Sure.
Fellow Animites. Yeah. All right. Good to see you all. Thank you so much for coming.
Everybody. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.